home for political junkies, and a way to track the government as it happened.
I think it's a great way for us to stay informed.
There are a lot of C-SPAN fans on the Hill. My colleagues, they're going to say, I saw you on C-SPAN.
There's so much more that C-SPAN does to make sure that people outside the Beltway know what's going on inside it.
Next, Q&A with former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Then British Prime Minister David Cameron takes questions from members of the House of Commons. After that, Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson's annual speech on the state of Homeland Security.
This week on Q&A, former Secretary of Defense and former Director of the CIA, Robert Gates. Mr. Gates discusses his book, A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service.
Robert Gates, and the Council on Foreign Relations recently had a column which said that the next President of the United States ought to read 5 books on the presidency. Yours was at the top on leadership. What would you want the next president to take away from your book on leadership?
I think surrounding himself or herself with really strong, capable, independent-minded people, empowering them, delegating authority to them, and holding them accountable. If they are successful, reward them in whatever way you can, and if they fail, fire them. I think that too much of what we always think about just the president, and the reality is the best presidents, the greatest presidents, have been willing to recognize they weren't the smartest person in the room, and to surround themselves with people they thought were smarter than themselves. So Washington had Jefferson and Hamilton and so on, and Lincoln and both Roosevelts and Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan were all willing to bring strong people into their cabinets, listen to them, integrate their views with their own. They didn't mind being if that person disagreed with them, and expected candid advice from them. I think that's a really important message for a president.
I want you to look up on the screen, and it's really your life on this screen, and it starts in Wichita, Kansas in 1943. And what I'm looking for as we go through this, for you to tell us at what point you started thinking about leadership. You've got your BA from William and Mary, your master's from Indiana University in history, the Russian history PhD from Georgetown, CIA starting in 1996, National Security Council 74 to 79, Deputy Director of the CIA 87 to 89. Then you were nominated but withdrew as CIA Director in 87, went on to be the Deputy National Security Council at 89, and then we have CIA Director back in 91 where you were confirmed. You did academic work, speaking and all from 93 to 99. Then you were the interim dean of the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M in 99 for a couple years. President of Texas A&M 2002 to 2006. Defense Secretary 2006 to 2011. Where along the way did you learn the different things you have in this book?
I write in the last chapter of the book that my first leadership position was as a patrol leader in Boy Scout Troop 522 in Wichita. And I write that nothing teaches you leadership skills like being in charge of a bunch of 11, 12, and 13-year-olds and trying to get them to do what they don't want to do, and you can't make them do it, and you're only a year or two older than they are. And then at 15, I had the only formal management and leadership training I ever had, and that was at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico when I was 15 years old. And that was my last formal training in leadership, but as I say in the book, I've been learning for 55 years ever since then. I don't think that I've always had, from my very first days at CIA, a desire. I've always had a feeling of how things could be made better. And I don't know if I would articulate it as sort of wanting to take leadership, but I saw where a good organization could be made better. So I wrote my first essay on how we could improve Soviet analysis at CIA when I'd been on active duty at the agency for 2 years. I'm sure my superiors were unimpressed, but I've felt that way about each organization that I've led. And I say in the book, I've loved them all, but I've always thought they could be better than they were. And so I've always been somebody who was pressing for change and to make improvements, and really from earliest days.
You tell the story in the book of a confrontation you had with Governor Rick Perry of Texas.
Well, this is all secondhand, but I was told that when I became the finalist for president of Texas A&M, he called me and basically tried to push me to withdraw my candidacy. And I'd always heard that he'd promised the job to somebody else. I heard that it was Senator Phil Gramm. I don't know that for a fact, but and Gramm had taught at A&M for about 10 years, I think. And I finally just told Perry, and he said he's going to appoint all the regents, and that it was not going to be pleasant for me if I decided to take the job. And I said, well, I'd heard that a lot of Aggies did want me to come, and I just let the Board of Regents make that decision. I later told my wife that what I'd actually been going through my mind at the time was that I'd been facing off with the deputy director of the KGB when he was first elected to the Texas House, and if he thought he could intimidate me, he was sadly mistaken.
What impact did that have on you the rest of the time as president of Texas A&M?
Well, he did go ahead and appoint, first of all, he hadn't counted votes, and 6 of the 9 regents had been appointed by George W. Bush at that time. So 5 of those regents voted for me. His 3 appointees voted against me, and 1 courageous soul abstained. So I became president of A&M on a 5 to 3 to 1 vote. He and I maintained outward civility. I think most people didn't know that we didn't have a great relationship. And I will say this, while I was there, he mostly left me alone. At one point, he tried to force me into hiring a friend of his as the vice president for student affairs, but I'd already extended an offer to a professional from the University of North Carolina, and I refused to do it. At the next Board of Regents meeting, they changed the rules to make it so that the Board of Regents had to approve any such appointment in the future, but I got my man.
You make a point in the book, a leadership point, about Senator Bob Byrd and your relationship with him.
Byrd was a very interesting guy. He was always very friendly to me. And I remember one story one time. You know, he was referred to by the Washington Post and others as the king of pork. And he was pretty good at taking federal money home to West Virginia. In fact, just about everything in the state's named for him. But at one point, the Post ran an editorial complaining that CIA had decided to build a $1 billion logistics facility, and the basic thrust of the Post editorial was that Byrd had forced them to build it in West Virginia. I knew for a fact that CIA knew the only way they could get the money for the facility was if they built it in West Virginia, and Byrd helped them. So it was CIA's initiative, not Senator Byrd's. So this story ran, and I was director of CIA at the time, and I called him up. And I said, Mr. Chairman, he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I said, would it be all right with you if I wrote a letter to the editor as Director of Central Intelligence saying that the story was wrong and setting the facts right? And I'll never forget, there was this long pause, and he said, almost plaintively, "You'd do that for me?" I said, well, it's only fair. I mean, those are the facts. So I wrote the letter, and the Post published it, and I called him the day that it appeared just to make sure he saw it. And Senator Boren of Oklahoma, who was also close to Byrd, told me that after that, pretty much any time my name came up around Senator Byrd, he'd say, "You know that Mr. Gates is an honorable man."
What was the lesson?
I think the lesson is, first of all, people forget that, people remember slights and insults, but I think what people don't understand in Washington well enough today is they also remember kindnesses. They also remember treating people decently, and that people who are on the receiving end never forget it. And I think too much, and I write about it in the book, too much emphasis is placed on sort of negative relationships, when in fact there are lots of opportunities day to day where you can do the right thing by somebody, and it may be a small thing. Maybe somebody works for you or somebody you work for, and they won't forget it.
We started this program in basically the same format 27 years ago, and here's something I have never seen that you have in this book. I want to put it on the screen. It's a picture from the book, and we've got the word SHE circled. And throughout this book, where you normally would have somebody refer to a leader as he, you decided to use she all through the book, hundreds and hundreds of times. Why?
Well, I tried to balance it using he in places and she in places. But first of all, it's 2016. There are a lot of women in leadership positions or who are about to assume leadership positions in companies, in local government, state government, the national government. And I wanted to make clear, particularly to young people, young women as well as young men, that these leadership opportunities are going to be open for everybody, and that these lessons apply regardless of your gender.
Get any comment on it since the book's been out?
Well, just the fact, just people noticing, as you have, that I use the word she throughout the book.
You tell a story in the book about a sergeant by the name of Jason Eason, I believe?
Eason.
I want to find out what that point was all about.
Well, one of the points, and I made it at the beginning of our conversation, was the importance of empowering subordinates and giving them responsibility. So Sergeant Eason worked in my outer office and in the reception area, and one of my senior military assistants decided there would be value in allowing these young men, mostly men, to participate in my overseas trips by doing advance work, by going there ahead of me and helping to prepare my visit and so on, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. So he sent Sergeant Eason out to do the advance work in Afghanistan, and the sergeant was meeting with a colonel who had his own ideas about what he wanted me to do, and mainly the colonel wanted me to sit and watch a bunch of PowerPoint briefings, and Sergeant Eason knew from me directly that I wanted to spend most of my time with the troops. And so he and the colonel went back and forth a little bit, and one had a full eagle on his shoulder and the other one had some stripes. And finally Jason walked over to the colonel's desk and he picked up the phone and he said, "One of the two of us can call the Secretary of Defense and have the call taken immediately." And the colonel smiled. He said, "I get your point," and did it Jason's way.
Back in 1991, when you were testifying before the Confirmation Committee in the Senate for the CIA director, you had this is just a clip with your relationship with Senator Metzenbaum. After we watch this, I want you to tell what this point was about.
What bothered me from the inception, bothers me now, is whether you were leveling with us, whether you were trying to sort of gild the lily a little bit, but not by saying, "I didn't read the North Notes," but you could have gone and read them when you got the interrogatories, and you could have then answered our question. But you didn't do that. I have difficulty with it.
Well, Senator, at times those questions were asking me what I thought Mr. North had been referring to when he would write something or other, and that's where I would answer that I didn't know. Because I far from me to know what was in his mind when he put something down.
Story?
Well, it was a long hearing, and I had one exchange with Senator Metzenbaum, and I had been testifying, I think at that time, for about 10 straight hours. And a big part of testifying on the Hill is not answering the question, but figuring out what the question is, because so often the member of Congress is making a speech. And I remember Senator Metzenbaum at one point read a very long and complicated page, and I was just exhausted, and I lost the bubble. I couldn't figure out what the question was. And I said, with all due respect, Senator, I'm tired. What's the question? And he didn't know what the question was. And one aide came up, sat down, or kneeled beside him, and they were going through it. Another aide came up and kneeled beside him, and he ended up reading the whole thing over again. And I found a question in there that I thought I could answer. But testifying in front of the Congress is always an interesting experience.
You spent 2 years in the service, and then as we saw in the bio, a lot of years in this town. What do you think of Congress?
Well, the thing that concerns me is that it has changed so much since I first came to Washington 50 years ago. When I came to Washington, and I'll use the Senate as an example because I remember the names better. Our politics has always been polarized, and after all, I came to Washington in 1966, so we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. Within a half a dozen years, we would be involved in Watergate, so things have never been smooth here in Washington. But there were always on the Hill a number of people, both Democrats and Republicans, center left, center right, who would reach across the aisle to get business done, to pass appropriations bills, to pass welfare reform, to pass legislation that moved the country forward. And I called that body of people the bridge builders, because they were building bridges across the aisle. And the sad thing is, nearly all of those people are gone. The Bill Bradleys, the Jack Danforths, the Bob Doles, the Sam Nunns, the David Borans, the Lloyd Bensons, Dick Lugar. There were probably 24 or more senators who were in that category, and you could actually get things done. And the committee chairs had real authority, and when they committed to do something, it would get done. And most of those people are gone. They didn't get defeated, for the most part. They got frustrated and fed up and left of their own accord. And a good example of this is in 1994, I got a call from David Boren, and he'd been offered the presidency of the University of Oklahoma. And he was wrestling with whether to leave the Senate to take this, and we talked for about an hour. And finally I said at the end of the conversation, I said, David, actually I think it's very easy. When you're daydreaming on a plane or when you're driving, are you daydreaming about what you could accomplish in the U.S. Senate or what you could accomplish at OU? And he laughed and he said, you're right, it is easy. And he took the OU job. So I think this is my concern, that it's not just that our politics are polarized, it's that the people who have in the past been able to come together and move things forward, so many of them are gone and so few are left. And a good example of this is the absence for years of regular appropriations bills. Just something as simple as funding the government from year to year. Out of the last 10 years, only 2 years has the Defense Department had an enacted appropriation at the beginning of the fiscal year, and that was 9 and 10 years ago. So for the last 8 years, we've had continuing resolutions or sequestration, but no regular order of business.
I'm not sure I'm right about this, but one of the biggest planes ever built in the United States is the C-5A, And you point out in your book that you wanted to retire some of the C-5As, and it's on the screen, it's a very big plane, and Congress didn't want to do it. So what happened?
Well, the Air Force wants to retire it because it eats money, and they have some of these original C-5As, and they're so old, they require an enormous amount of money to maintain, and some of them never fly. They will drag them around the tarmac at the Air Force Base so the wheels don't go flat. That's the only time they ever move. But because they are part of National Guard units, or Air National Guard units, members of Congress in which those bases are located won't let them be decommissioned, no matter how much money they cost the Air Force, and they can't perform any kind of mission at all.
How often does this happen between the Congress and the Pentagon?
All the time. I mean, the recent testimony, you have the leadership of the Pentagon telling the Congress that they have 24% of the facilities the military has in the U.S. are excess to need. But the Congress won't let the military shut them down and save that overhead.
What's the solution to that?
Well, I think, the question is whether you have one of these long, drawn-out BRAC processes, where you appoint a commission to look at military facilities, and then you present the Congress with a kind of up and down vote on a list of bases. It takes years, and it's very expensive, and so on. I mean, my view is the Congress ought to authorize the Secretary of Defense to be able to close facilities when the service will testify that there is no longer a need for that facility or for that weapons system or piece of equipment. When I was Secretary in 2009, most of my predecessors canceled, if they were lucky, 1 or 2 or 3 major procurements. I remember when Dick Cheney was Secretary under the first President Bush, he canceled the A-12 fighter, and that was in 1992, I think, maybe 91, and the litigation for that ended, I think, just 2 years ago. And the other program he killed was the Osprey, flown by the Marines, which of course is still flying because the Congress wouldn't let him kill it. In 2009, I cut 36 programs. Had they been built out to completion, they would have cost the taxpayers about $330 billion. I got 33 of them approved or acquiesced in by Congress the first year, and I got the remainder the following year. And partly it was I involved, and it really goes to some of the lessons in the book. These were very important programs, most of them. The services had fought for them, but I involved the service leadership in all these decisions. We had many meetings. They had the opportunity to make their own suggestions of programs that they thought were no longer needed. Sometimes they put programs in their budgets because they knew if they didn't, the Congress would. So they just sort of preemptively conceded the matter. I said, if you don't want it, leave it out. I'll leave the politics to me. But then I announced, so the first principle was, because I had all the service chiefs on board, none of them leaked and none of them went to the Hill behind my back to try and get the Congress to reverse those decisions. Second, and this is just a tactical thing, I publicly announced all these cuts while the Congress was out of town. And I had 2 weeks before they came back, and a really strong, there was a real groundswell of public support for what I'd done in the media and elsewhere. So the Congress, when it arrived back in town, was already behind the 8 ball politically. There were so many of these programs, it was hard for the members of Congress to make deals with each other like they always used to. And I had the threat of a very strong threat of a veto by President Obama if they put things back in we didn't want. So there are a lot of tactics on how you can get these things done, but it also involves having relationships with members of Congress, that ultimately are productive. And I think one of the things about my book, Duty, that surprised a lot of people on the Hill was how negative I was toward the Congress, because I had had a very productive relationship with them and very cooperative, just like the story about Senator Byrd. So I think I just exercised an enormous amount of self-discipline in terms of keeping my real feelings about them hidden the whole time I had the job. Although I will say in the last 2 or 3 months, my discipline began to slip a little. And there were a couple of occasions when I got pretty sharp on the Hill, and that was part of the reason I knew it was time to leave.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is firing people, and you fired a lot of people, generals and secretaries and all that. I want to go back to 2007. This is you announcing the firing, resignation, and I want to talk about that, your idea of letting them resign instead of being fired. Army Secretary Francis Harvey. Let's watch this.
Good afternoon. I have 2 announcements to make. First, earlier today, Secretary of the Army, Dr. Fran Harvey, offered his resignation. I have accepted his resignation. Under Secretary of the Army, Pete Karen, will serve as acting secretary until a new secretary is in place. I thank Dr. Harvey for his distinguished service to the department and to the nation. Second, later today, the Army will name a new permanent commander for the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. This flagship institution must have its new leadership in place as quickly as possible. I am disappointed that some in the Army have not adequately appreciated the seriousness of the situation pertaining to outpatient care at Walter Reed. Some have shown too much defensiveness and have not shown enough focus on digging into and addressing the problems.
As you know, you've acknowledged that some people think you're cold when it comes to firing. Explain your philosophy of firing somebody.
Well, as part of my view of improving organizations, I am willing to hold people accountable. And I think that particularly, and even when I was a young CIA officer, whenever there was a problem, it always seemed like the people low down on the totem pole were the ones that got punished. And superiors who should have known about the problem and should have dealt with the problem escaped unscathed. And I told myself then, this is back in the 70s, that if I were ever in a position of authority, that's not the way it was going to be. That I wasn't going to go out of my way to find a scapegoat or something, but if I came to the conclusion somebody had not taken the problem seriously enough or had made a big mistake, that they would in fact be held accountable. What I've tried to do throughout my career, and I did this at CIA, I did it at Texas A&M, and I did it in the Defense Department. Most of these people are good people, and they've given good previous service. So I tried not to humiliate them. I tried to deal with them in a manner that preserved their dignity. So I would always give them the opportunity to resign. I told one person, one vice president, that I had asked to retire at Texas A&M. I said, I don't care if you go out there and say I wouldn't work one more minute for that SOB Gates. I said, I won't counter that at all. You handle it any way you want, but you're going to leave. I think what has bothered me for a long time is that people in Washington lose their jobs all the time. But mainly they lose them because of personal peccadillos, personal misbehavior of one kind or another. What's unusual in Washington, too rare in my view, is people losing their jobs because they didn't do the job well enough, or that they had made a serious mistake, or that they had failed in some way. And so when I find that a problem like we had at Walter Reed, frankly, a couple of senior Army people tried to pass that off as a couple of NCOs not doing their jobs, which I will tell you just inflamed me. But I when there's a systemic problem, then it's and when a problem is brought to a senior person's attention and they don't do enough about it to solve it, then I think they ought to be held accountable.
How often did you fire somebody face to face?
Every person I ever relieved or fired, I did face to face, with the sole exception of when I fired the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force over mishaps in our nuclear weapons program. And there I had intended to do it face to face, but news of what I was doing was beginning to leak, and they were out of town. So I asked Admiral Mullen to talk to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Admiral Mullen was chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time. And my deputy, Gordon England, was going to be in a same place as the Secretary of the Air Force, and so I had them do it face to face. When I decided that I had to relieve the commander in Afghanistan, I flew all the way to Afghanistan to sit down with him face to face and tell him what he was going to do. This is something that actually always bothered me a little bit about presidents. I worked for 8 presidents, and as best as I know, only 2 of them I ever heard fired people face to face. And it was
Which 2?
It was Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. And everybody else had a hatchet man who did that work for them.
Another incident.
But I always felt it ought to be done face to face.
Another incident where you talk in the book about, and I want to know what you do about this if you were Secretary of Defense when this happened. Here is General Eric Shinseki. This is a famous point in the whole Iraq, before the Iraq War started, where he talks about the number of troops needed in Iraq if we go in there. And this would have been back in February of 2003. The war started in March of that year. Let's watch what General Shinseki said.
Could you give us some ideas to the magnitude of the Army's force requirement for an occupation of Iraq following a successful completion of the war?
I would say that what's been mobilized to this point, something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers are probably a figure that would be required. We're talking about post-hostilities, control over a piece of geography that's fairly significant with the kinds of ethnic tensions that could lead to other problems, and so it takes a significant ground force presence.
You weren't there then, but was he fired because of that statement?
Well, as you say, I wasn't there. What I have heard was that he wasn't fired so much as just sidelined and sort of cast into the outer darkness, if you will, for the remainder of his term.
Was he right?
Well, one of the things that I think it's not actually written into law, but it is a practice and it is a question that the Senate Armed Services Committee asks of every senior officer who comes before them to testify, and that is, if we ask, will you give us your personal, professional, military judgment on any given question? And the answer is always yes. And I put what General Shinseki did into that category. And so I had officers, including the chairman, who would go up to the Hill and say things that the White House, the president, really didn't like. But I defended them because I thought that they had a responsibility in preserving their integrity to answer the questions that they were asked. If they were asked for their personal, professional, military judgment, they needed to be truthful in offering that opinion. And frankly, it's obviously a tool in the hands of the Congress to try and drive a wedge between the professional military and the political leadership, whether it's the Secretary or the President. But even being aware of that, I think that sometimes I hold some of the members of Congress more responsible for some of these episodes because they know they're putting the officer in a terrible position. And only because of the officer's integrity do they know they'll get the answer that they're looking for. And so I'm more inclined to blame the person who's posing the question than the officer who answers honestly. But I had a number of cases like that. I had both President Bush and President Obama just really chew on parts of me that because of some of that testimony. But I told them that's their responsibility.
8 presidents. Did you know them all? Were you face to face with all of them?
The only one that I never met was the first one, Lyndon Johnson.
So over those years, who was the most angry with you at any given time, and why?
Oh, I think pretty easily President Obama, and it was because we had a difference in I think that the issue over which first of all, let me say he was really good about letting me be honest with him and push back on him when I disagreed. He never cast me into the outer darkness. He never shunned me or stopped talking to me or anything. I think he valued the candor, and so I've always given him credit for his patience and willingness to hear me out. But I think that probably when he was the angriest with me was over Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and really was over a difference in strategy of how to implement it. And in particular, he wanted me, as part of getting a federal judge had in California had basically ruled Don't Ask, Don't Tell unconstitutional. And that meant that the law was a goner right then, unless we got a stay of that order from the Ninth Circuit Court. And the president was very unwilling to seek the stay. He wanted to go ahead and get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I said, you really can't let this be done by an act of a single judge or by your executive order. This needs to be done with the consent and the support of the Congress. And he said, all right, I'll seek the stay I'll direct the Attorney General to seek the stay in the Ninth Circuit, but you've got to suspend application of the law. And I said, Mr. President, I can't do that. There's either law or no law. I said, you're the constitutional lawyer, but I have an obligation I took an oath to to obey the Constitution and obey the law, and I can't do that. And finally, it was pretty tense. And finally he said, well, I won't make you do anything you don't feel is right. And but it was very clear to me he was very angry with me. As it turned out, we did the review. We learned that 2/3 of the military had no objection to changing the law and having gays serve openly. Part of that 2/3 were people who thought it would actually lead to an improvement, and I think it paved the way for the smooth introduction of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Again, a lesson from the book. We surveyed 400,000 troops, 150,000 military spouses, so they felt like we at least respected them enough to ask them, what problems do you foresee? How do you think about this? Because everything we knew was all anecdotal. So this was really the first time ever that we'd taken a survey to try and figure out what they really thought. You know, some members of Congress said, well, you're doing a plebiscite. I said, no, the military never takes a vote on what we're going to do, but I do want to know what they think. And they deserve to have that opportunity. And I think, Brian, one of the consequences is it's been implemented, and I think with virtually no problems.
You like task forces, you say in the book, and you call them silo busters. You talk about trying to reduce $180 billion in defense expenditure near the end of your term as Secretary of Defense. And you say you were in 61 meetings that lasted anywhere from 1 hour to 8 hours. Talk about task forces and how you've used them.
Well, a lot of people, for a long time I bought into the definition of a committee as a cul-de-sac down which ideas are lured and then quietly strangled. But I found in all three of the places that I led that communication up and down generally goes pretty well, but communication laterally across an organization is almost always very poor. So one part of the organization doesn't really communicate with another part, except at the very top. And so my view was, if you get people out of their normal bureaucratic environment and where they're not under the eyes of their supervisors or they're not compelled to defend their home turf, that you can actually tap into the creativity and the talent that you have in an organization in getting ideas on how do we make this place better, how do we move it forward. But the key is making sure you appoint the right kind of person as the head of the task force, somebody who not only can move it to a good conclusion, but make sure that consensus isn't the objective. The objective is, what are some really bold proposals to move us forward, and if there's disagreement on those, that's fine. But also a person chairing it who then can be a defender of the recommendations in the institution. So you want somebody respected enough that they have clout within the organization. And then perhaps the most important thing, or two most important things, very short deadlines, and then disband them. As I write in the book, unconstrained task forces are a danger.
How hard was it to reduce the budget by $180 billion? Is that over 10 years?
Yeah. And, well, 5 to 10 years. It was over multi-years. But a part of it was actually a budget exercise that was, I think, unique. I told the services, we cut of the 180, we cut $80 billion from the Department of Defense more broadly, and we returned that to the Treasury. The other $100 billion, I told the services, was assigned to the services to find those cuts through consolidating headquarters, removing programs, just tightening up. And what I told the services was, we need to do better at cutting overhead so we can use the money to strengthen our military capabilities. We're wasting money on overhead. Headquarters, too big of staffs, too many contractors and things like that. So here's the deal. If you cut X dollars out of your overhead and you make a good case on how you could use that money to strengthen military capabilities, I'll give you the money back. And they did. They cut the overhead, and then we used that money to buy more aircraft, buy more ships, do more things in terms of military capabilities. I think there's room to do more of that in the Department of Defense.
Has the Department of Defense ever been audited?
Well, we get audited in different ways by different people, but when it comes to sort of a formal, general accepted accounting practices, the answer is no. And the department has been working for years to get itself into a position of where it knows where all the money has gone and has that documented and can present it in sort of formal accounting practices. Now, do we know where the money goes? Yes. Does huge amounts of money just sort of disappear into the ether and nobody knows where it went? No. And you know, GAO and other organizations are always looking at us, Inspector General in the department, the Congress. So I think that there isn't the lack of having what would be called gap practices on auditing, I think doesn't mean that the department's spending or records are out of control or useless. What it does mean is that in a formal accounting sense, we have fallen short, and the services have been making a big effort to try and get that right.
I wrote a bunch of things down from the book, and you say you became an ardent advocate for greater transparency. There's too much that is being kept secret in the government. That the Department of Defense leaked like a sieve. That they try to stamp them out and I can't even read my own writing, rarely come to a good end. When they try, the point you were making is that when the government tries to stamp out leakers, it rarely comes to a good end. Talk about some of that stuff.
Well, as I write in the book, I spent my life in CIA and in Defense Department in an ocean of secrecy. I had clearances I had forgotten about for programs I had forgotten existed, and so on. At the end of the Cold War, when I was Director of Central Intelligence, I came to believe very strongly that the American people had given CIA a pass on a lot of things because of this existential conflict with the Soviet Union. And I believed that after the end of the Cold War, we were going to have to be more open about what we did and why we did it, and even to an extent how we did it, to help the American people better understand why intelligence was important to the government and to presidents, and why presidents valued it. And so I committed to declassify all the estimates CIA had ever done on the Soviet Union. I committed to declassify details on covert actions that had taken place in the early 1950s, to make some more senior officials available both to the press and for open hearings on the Hill. And I felt the same way in the Department of Defense. Now, sometimes the transparency isn't to the public, but the transparency is internal. You know, there are a lot of bosses who say, if you only knew what I knew, you'd understand why I decided. I think most of the time that betrays either somebody who's very arrogant or somebody who's very insecure. I found that in being very transparent about what I was trying to do as Director of Central Intelligence and as Secretary of Defense, inside the building, so there were no secrets in terms of my agenda and where I was headed, that it was a strength. So when I had all these task forces at CIA, when those task forces gave me their reports, I made those reports widely available in CIA and in the intelligence community. And when I would draft a decision memo, I would make that draft available, because it seemed to me, I'm sitting up there on the 7th floor, and if some GS-13 on the 3rd floor is going to have to implement it, he or she may have a better idea of how to do this effectively than I have. And I want to hear that. If they thought that I could reframe this decision memo in a way that would actually make it better to accomplish my goal, I wanted to know that. In the Defense Department, when we were cutting programs or when we were fighting 2 wars, if people had ideas that they wanted to share, I wanted to hear it. And I wanted them to know what I was trying to do at the same time. So my experience both as Director of Central Intelligence and as Secretary of Defense, and I would say it was also true at Texas A&M. I mean, I remember my first staff meeting at Texas A&M on the budget, and I invited the Speaker of the Faculty Senate and the Speaker and the Chair of the President of the student body in. I said, this isn't CIA. We don't have any secrets here, so we need input from everybody. And so my experience in all 3 places was that transparency, first of all, built trust. It reassured people that there weren't hidden agendas, and it made people feel like they were a part of the process and that their views were welcome.
Which of the presidents that you worked for did you, I don't want to say what was the best or anything, but which one did you enjoy on a day-to-day basis working with the most?
Oh, I think I'd have to say George H.W. Bush. I was assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor from January '89 until November '91, and first of all, he's just an amazing human being. Good humor, open, eager to hear people's views, willing to banter back and forth and have a debate, willing to see his own people debate. But it was also an amazing time. So I joined CIA out of the Russian Institute or Russian History Department at Indiana University to do my bit in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so I go to the White House with him in '89, and we have the liberation of Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany and NATO, victory in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was spending 2, 3, 4 hours a day with the president, traveling domestically with him because he wanted either General Scowcroft or me with him. I mean, it was just an amazing time. We knew we were making history every single day, and he was so good at it, and he managed it so well that every day was exciting, and he made it also fun.
I want to run a clip. It's about a minute long. It's a man named Mike Lofgren. I don't know if you know the name or not. He was for 28 years a staff member in the budget committees over in the Hill, and he looked at your book, Duty, the first book you wrote, or actually it was your second book, and then analyzed you here after 2014. I want you to see this. So what's a Republican today, in your opinion? What's a Democrat?
Well, I think to dispose first of Gates, he is an ideological operative of the permanent regime that exists whether you are a Democrat or a Republican in the Oval Office. These people pose as technocrats, as experts on national security, or for that matter, like Larry Summers and some others, they pose as nonpartisan experts on economics and fiscal policy. But in reality, they are all deeply ideological. They believe in military force abroad. They believe in the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism or free market style crony capitalism at home.
He used to work for John Kasich before he went on the Budget Committee, when he was chairman of the Budget Committee. But anyway, what do you think of his analysis of you?
Well, I guess I would have to say I disagree. I think that, first of all, if when he lumped me in with people saying that we were for the use of military force abroad, he clearly didn't read the last chapter of Duty, where I expressed the view that I felt that American presidents had become too willing to use force in resolving international problems, and that the use of force had become too easy for American presidents. So, I mean, it's in writing that I have a very different view than he just described. In terms of crony capitalism or whatever, I don't know what that means for somebody who's been in the national security arena. I don't know what his philosophical or ideological bent is, but I don't think, I certainly don't recognize the person he describes, and I don't think most of the people who've worked with me would either.
Journalist Doug Waller a couple years ago wrote a piece, and it's a little bit dated, but said that there were 30 generals that were on the boards of the top 10 defense contractors, ex-generals. What do you think of that trend?
I think it's a concern, and for example, I've been offered the opportunity to serve on the board of some defense contractors, and I've turned it down. The only board I serve on, the only board of directors I serve on, is Starbucks, and I think that people have to be more sensitive to the appearances of things. But I think you can take it too far. For example, we've reached a point where the ethics rules now for people coming into the government are so strict that it makes it very difficult. If you have, let's just take defense industries as an example. If you've worked in the defense industry, if you know how defense contracting works, if you know how the contractors play the game, and you've worked for one of them, chances are you're not going to be allowed to become a senior official in the Department of Defense under the current ethics rules. And so what do you end up with, and who do you end up with in those senior positions? But academics or Hill staffers or people who have no real-world experience in defense contracting. And it seems to me that through transparency or blind trust or whatever, there ought to be a way for people who actually know what they're doing in this arena to be able to come to work for the government, and without people thinking that they're just feathering their nest for the future. In terms of, and I think to a degree, you can reverse that. I think for a defense industry, having a general officer who has real world experience in how those products are used brings real value to a corporate board. And I just think that retired officers just need to think about appearances, because and what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that one size fits all. I don't think there should be a blanket prohibition on this, but I think people do need to be sensitive to whether there is the appearance of a vicious circle of people moving in and out of government and into defense industries, back into government, and so on.
Your book, Duty, as you look back on, first of all, do you know how many you sold?
I think, well, not specifically, but I think close to 500,000.
What surprised you about that experience of Duty, and what was the reaction that you didn't expect?
I think that the thing that surprised me the most was how well it was received by current and former members of the military, and that it gave them some insight into the decisions that affected their lives, and to be honest, reassured them that the person who had been in charge of the department really cared about them as individuals and the well-being of them and their families. You know, I was prepared for the usual Washington hubbub when it first came out, but I think, you know, I was struck by the fact that the Obama White House never said a negative thing about the book.
Did you get any reaction out of the president?
No, and I sent a copy to President Bush, and so I think most people thought it was pretty fair.
What was more interesting to write, and how much of it did you write yourself? The Duty book or this book, A Passion for Leadership?
Well, I wrote both of them entirely myself. I don't even have a research assistant. Actually, that's one of the things that I've been proudest of Duty, is that I did it all myself, and none of the reviews or anybody to this point has pointed out a factual error to me. So I feel pretty good about that. I guess I have to thank Google and Wikipedia for that. But I wrote them both myself. Duty was more an integration of information and documents, and there was a lot of things to pull together and put together a coherent story. This book, A Passion for Leadership, is really kind of all out of my head, just based on the experiences that I've had starting 50 years ago.
Going to do another book?
Well, the publisher's talking to me about it. As I like to put it to people, I'm not sure I'm ready to have another baby.
And if you did write another one, what kind of a subject would you write about?
Well, I probably would take on more of a policy-oriented subject.
Our guest has been Robert M. Gates. The book is A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
If you like this week's Q&A interview, here are some others you might enjoy. Former congressional staff member Mike Lofgren talks about his book on the two-party system and his op-ed on former Secretary Gates' 2014 memoir. Admiral Michelle Howard on becoming the first female four-star admiral in the history of the Navy and her role as Vice Chief of Naval Operations. And former Military.com editor Ward Carroll on defense issues and the cost of military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can watch these interviews and others online at cspan.org.
Monday night on The Communicators. Minion Clyburn, the longest-serving FCC commissioner, talks about major communications issues, including next month's Spectrum auctions, the cost of phone service to and from prison inmates, the FCC's net neutrality rules, and unlimited streaming of some video by a few internet providers, known as zero rating. She's joined by Wall Street Journal technology reporter John McKinnon.
We should always be evolving, always improving.